The desert noon burned white as Jack Mercer rode the arroyo's rim, and the world held its breath. Wind scraped mesquite like knives on bone, and a hawk's cry split the sky. Jack felt the angle of danger before he saw it. Amos Reed said, "You keep your eyes on the dust, boy." A rifle cracked from the butts, and sand leapt at Jack's boots. He slid from the saddle and dragged the reins low. Eli Carter said, "I got you, Jack." Jack tasted grit and old regret. Another shot rang, closer, meaner. Sheriff Cole Maddox watched from the ridge, his badge winking like a snake's eye. Lila Dawson stood by a freight wagon, still as a painting, and did not call out. Victor Hale's riders ghosted the skyline like black seeds on a white plate. Jack steadied his breath, counted echoes, and found the shooter's nest. "Come on then," Jack said. "I'm listening." The hawk wheeled down, and silence snapped into place. The third shot hit the canteen and baptized the sand with loss. Jack rose into the sun, drew, and met the day head-on. The shots faded into the far mesas, and silence felt like a trap that had not yet sprung. Jack studied the ridge, mapping angles the way a preacher maps sin. Eli said, "They wanted you standing still." Jack brushed dust from his coat and weighed the day's arithmetic. The horse shivered, and a breath of wind carried iron and sage. Cole Maddox rode down with a measured trot, face unreadable, voice smooth as oil. Cole Maddox said, "Law came to keep folks safe." Jack kept his hands low, and his eyes lower. Lila stepped from the wagon's shade, her gaze an ember held close. Lila Dawson said, "This road eats men who pretend it is a friend." A wheel creaked like an old confession. Jack saw the ambush angles fold into order and tasted the memory of a name he could not forgive. He said, "Order's a word knives like to wear." The sun pressed harder, daring someone to lie. Cole smiled small, and shadows shortened. The posse trailed off, leaving ruts and riddles in their wake. Jack led the horse toward a stand of cottonwoods where the air felt almost kind. Eli said, "You think it was Hale?" Jack measured the boy's fear and found courage threaded through it. He said, "Hale buys thunder and sells silence." A crow hopped along a fence post, arrogant as a banker. Lila kept pace, boots neat in the dust, eyes weighing and reweighing him. Lila Dawson said, "Hale does not miss when he means to hit." The canteen dripped its last into sand, and the ground drank without thanks. Jack smelled the metal of old nights and the rope burn of memory. From the trees a voice with gravel in it floated out. Amos Reed said, "You two look like men who forgot to duck." Jack did not smile. He said, "We remembered late." The cottonwoods shivered in a heat that did not forgive. Amos' eyes read Jack like a ledger of wrongs and payments due. Amos Reed said, "Cole wears law like a Sunday coat, but the lining is Hale." Jack weighed the weight he already carried. Eli looked between them, young and hungry for edges to seem straight. Lila folded her arms, guarding truths that cost too much to spend. Jack said, "They fired to measure me." Amos nodded once, slow as winter. He said, "They will fire to finish you next." The leaves rustled, and the light broke into coins across the dust. Eli Carter said, "We can ride now." Jack felt the road yawning wide and mean. He said, "We ride, but we do not run." Somewhere a church bell counted noon with a tired hand. The land listened, and did not care. They saddled under the whisper of leaves and the grit of decision. Amos Reed said, "Hale wants you loud." Jack tightened the cinch and let the words pass through. Lila Dawson said, "Noise makes smoke, and smoke hides hands." Eli checked the rifle and tried to look older than he felt. Jack said, "We make our noise where it pays." The road to town shone like a blade laid flat. Cole Maddox would polish that blade with sermons about order. Jack tasted the old ash of a burned name and kept his face still. Amos' hand landed on his shoulder, heavy as a verdict and gentle as a prayer. Amos Reed said, "Choose the end before it chooses you." Jack swung into the saddle and set his eyes on the hard horizon, where debts keep books. Jack watched the horizon smolder like a forge, and memory clawed through the dust. He had once walked into Hale's town with trust, and walked out carrying ashes. Eli Carter said, "What did he take from you?" Jack touched the scar under his shirt like it still bled. He said, "Everything that made a man sleep." Lila Dawson's eyes followed his silence with questions she did not spend. The freight road creaked, and the world leaned closer to hear him choke down the truth. Amos Reed said, "Hale carved your life into debt." Jack spat into the dirt and felt the sun scorch his back like a whip. He whispered a name no one else could carry. The boy heard the tremor, and the girl saw the wound. Amos turned away, giving him privacy he never asked for. The cottonwoods sighed as though they mourned, and the silence thickened until Jack said, "This road was built on graves, mine among them." Evening cooled the ground, but not the fire between them. Lila Dawson stepped closer, her shadow long across the wagon wheel. She said, "You burn with ghosts, Jack, but fire blinds too." Jack met her gaze and found steel under her grace. He said, "Ghosts keep a man sharp." Eli shifted, caught between awe and suspicion. Amos Reed drew on his pipe, smoke curling like sermons unspoken. Jack saw the lines of trust bending around her, fragile as glass. Lila's smile carried both invitation and warning. She said, "Hale knows how to twist fire into chains." The horses stamped, unsettled by her tone. Jack's hand lingered on the revolver, but his eyes lingered on her. She was both answer and question. The air thickened with scent of mesquite and menace. The boy's eyes darted between them, learning that truth could cut both ways. The road stretched black with night, stars cold as iron filings. Eli Carter said, "Jack, I can stand with you." His voice cracked like dry wood. Jack weighed him, saw eagerness wrapped in fear. He said, "Standing is not the same as lasting." Eli flinched but lifted his chin. Lila Dawson smirked faintly, whispering, "The boy's braver than he knows." Amos Reed answered with silence, his eyes reflecting firelight. Jack poured coffee bitter as regret and handed the tin to Eli. The boy gripped it like it was proof of manhood. The night wind rustled through, carrying a distant coyote's hymn. Jack's thoughts wandered to graves behind him and debts ahead. Eli said, "Then teach me to last." Jack's gaze sharpened with reluctant pride, and he said, "Lesson 1 is surviving the night without dreaming easy." At dawn the town lay below, a beast with smoke for breath. Cole Maddox's men patrolled the street, boots clanging like chains. A farmer knelt by broken boards, whipped by silence as Hale's hand pressed on all. Jack said, "This is his sermon." Eli clenched fists. Amos Reed said, "Every tyrant writes scripture in fear." Lila Dawson's eyes softened at the sight of children, sweeping dust where blood had been. She said, "This is not a town, it is a cage." Jack's jaw hardened as if carved from the same stone as the street. He remembered laughter here once, now buried under Hale's boots. Eli whispered, "We can't leave them like this." Jack's silence was louder than any vow. Amos' shadow fell across them like a warning. Every move forward meant a toll. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of boots and laughter like broken glass. Down the street, Victor Hale stood on the saloon balcony, voice booming as he mocked mercy. His riders flanked him, rifles gleaming like fangs. Jack froze at the sight, rage boiling against discipline. Hale said, "This town drinks my law." The townsfolk dropped eyes like beaten dogs. Eli whispered, "He's everything you said." Jack's lips shaped silence sharper than steel. Lila Dawson's breath trembled. She knew Hale too well. Amos Reed said, "Power rots loudest." Jack watched the balcony, mind chiseling revenge into stone. The sun rose higher, bleaching the street into judgment. Hale's smile cut across the dust, and Jack's resolve tightened into a noose he swore to pull. Jack reached the jail porch as noon hammered nails into the sky, and the badge on Cole Maddox threw sharp light like a blade. Cole Maddox said, "Law holds this town together." Jack heard the click behind the words. Eli shifted near the hitch rail, and fear made a thin edge in his breath. Jack said, "Law that drinks from Hale's trough is not water." Cole's smile barely moved, but the street leaned closer to hear it creak. Cole Maddox said, "Order keeps graves shallow." A pair of riders watched from the saloon shade, counting heartbeats like coins. Jack felt the day narrow to a door he would have to kick. Lila Dawson crossed the street, her eyes steady, her step quiet as a fuse. She said, "Careful where you place your foot." Eli looked at her as if she could split the sun. Cole's hand rested on the butt of his pistol like a sermon written on steel. Jack said, "Order without justice is a hangman with clean boots." The wind stopped to listen, and the porch boards waited for a name to be spoken. Trouble came sideways from the alley, a muzzle flashed like a wink from hell. Eli jerked and stumbled toward the open street. Jack moved before thought could argue. Jack said, "Down." The bullet gutted a barrel and vomited water across dust. A second report slapped the walls. Lila grabbed the boy's collar and yanked him into the lee of the trough. Lila Dawson said, "Keep your head, Eli." Jack slid across the boards and found the shooter's angle by echo and smell. He said, "Left stack of crates." Eli nodded, trying to swallow the quiver in his bones. Cole Maddox stood very still, cold eyes measuring bodies like tallies. Cole Maddox said, "Reckless men invite lead." Jack hooked a boot, kicked the crates, and dragged a canvas to blind the sightline. The next shot bit cloth and died angry. Jack said, "Run the alley." Eli sprinted low, and Jack stepped into the open to catch the danger meant for the boy. Night spilled over the rooftops like ink poured from a careful hand. Lila moved alone behind the hotel, feet silent on worn boards. The back door opened on a breath that smelled of leather and victory. Victor Hale said, "You walk pretty for someone in a storm." Lila did not flinch. She said, "Storms hide tracks." Hale leaned in the dim rings, catching lamplight like small suns with cold hearts. Victor Hale said, "Bring me Mercer's next step." Lila's jaw worked once, then stilled. She said, "He does not step blind." Hale's smile weighed her soul and found it marketable. He said, "Everyone sells. Price is timing." A piano clanged off-key inside, and laughter chipped at the dark. Lila held the shadow like a cloak and gave him nothing that tasted like fear. She said, "You will have news when I have terms." Hale's eyes narrowed to wires. He said, "Soon." The door closed like a verdict, and night finished falling. Dawn did not come gentle. Riders tore the street with hooves and laughter, and windows blinked awake in terror. Victor Hale's men kicked doors and threw fear like grain. A storekeeper bled pride into the gutter while his wife held air and nothing else. Jack stepped from the livery, and anger tried to own him. Amos Reed said, "Choose your distance." Jack said, "Close enough to count." Eli's hands shook, but his eyes steadied on the hurt. Lila stood near the church rail, her face a mask the world had earned. Cole Maddox rode through the dust as if presiding over weather. Cole Maddox said, "Stand down." Hale watched from the balcony, one hand on the rail like a king who bought the crown at noon. Jack said, "Your law eats." Then the street bucked with another shot, and a sign shattered into syllables of ruin. Smoke thinned, and left the bones of the morning. Jack walked the wreckage and counted costs like a debtor who finally reads the ledger. A child picked porcelain from dust, and the world winced. Eli Carter said, "Tell me we answer this." Jack's gaze cut to the balcony where Hale had stood like a sermon of contempt. Jack said, "We answer where it hurts, and when it sticks." Amos Reed nodded, the line of his mouth hard as a fence post. Amos Reed said, "Plan it cold or bury it hot." Lila Dawson watched him weigh blood against purpose, and something in her steadied or broke. She said, "There is a back way to the freight yard." Jack turned that over and found it true. He said, "Then we start there." The wind carried away the last splinters of laughter, and the town held its breath for the next line in the story. Night carried the smell of ash and confession when Amos Reed spoke as if the desert itself had demanded it. Amos Reed said, "I helped Hale carve your ruin." Jack froze, his pulse like hoofbeats. Amos' eyes held storms older than dust. He said, "Your father's land, your name. It was my bargain to live one more year." Jack's breath rasped, as if gravel lived inside him. Eli Carter whispered, "You?" His youth cracked in two. Lila Dawson stood still, her gaze heavy with pity sharp enough to wound. Jack said, "You sold me whole." Amos lowered his face, scar cut by lamplight. Amos Reed said, "I carried shame longer than law would allow." Silence turned into judgment, louder than a gallows crowd. Jack's fingers twitched near his revolver, then stilled, nailed by the weight of betrayal. The night did not move, and the stars refused to blink. The fire burned low, and Lila Dawson's voice cracked like fine glass. She said, "Hale owns half my soul." Jack's stare locked onto her, and her shoulders squared against judgment. She whispered, "He holds my brother in chains, hidden beyond town." Eli's eyes widened with betrayal, sharpened by compassion. Jack said, "You walk between fires and call it shade." She trembled once, then steadied. Lila Dawson said, "I am torn, but torn cloth still covers." Amos Reed looked away, his guilt a mirror. Jack's anger cooled into steel, dangerous and controlled. He said, "If you betray me again, you won't walk from it." Lila swallowed and nodded, the decision written in her silence. Eli Carter whispered, "Can we trust her?" Jack said, "We trust her shadow until morning." The fire hissed, and the desert closed its fists. Dawn split the sky, and Victor Hale's voice cut sharper than the sun. Victor Hale said, "Your blood runs in my pocket." Jack stared across the street as Hale unfurled the secret like a noose. Victor Hale said, "Your father built with my money, and I took the deed with his breath." Jack's chest hollowed, rage folding into silence. Lila Dawson gasped, hand trembling at the rail. Eli Carter whispered, "He took your kin." Hale leaned forward from the balcony, eyes burning cruel truth. He said, "You wear his sin like a coat." Jack felt the ground tilt, the world narrowed to dust and vengeance. Amos Reed clenched his jaw, knowing his betrayal was woven in that story too. Jack said, "You live on graves, Hale, but you forget they remember." The townsfolk scattered, sensing a storm in human form. The morning light showed no mercy. Eli Carter's voice cracked, young and burning. Eli Carter said, "You carry hate like a shield, but what does it leave me?" Jack stared at him, torn between pride and regret. Jack said, "It leaves you alive, if you learn where to point it." Eli's fist shook, boyhood slipping from his fingers like sand. Amos Reed stepped forward, voice heavy as stone. Amos Reed said, "Loyalty makes men, but it breaks them too." Lila Dawson watched with eyes that carried both sorrow and resolve, her body tense against the rail. The wind rattled the town's windows like bones in a bag. Jack grabbed Eli's shoulders, harder than mercy allowed. He said, "You choose what kind of man to be now." Eli met his stare, young steel glinting in raw fire. The day cracked wider with every word unspoken. Jack walked into the church's ruined silence, boots echoing off splintered pews. The smell of old incense tangled with dust. He dropped to one knee, hands trembling not from prayer, but from rage. Jack said, "Vengeance eats, but justice buries." The cross above tilted as if heaven itself leaned away. Amos Reed entered, steps heavy, voice low. Amos Reed said, "This is where you decide what kind of man dies in you." Jack's breath caught, eyes wet with fire. Lila Dawson hovered in the doorway, torn between faith and fear. Eli Carter stood outside, jaw clenched, waiting for a verdict only Jack could deliver. Jack rose slow, shoulders squared like a gallows beam. He said, "Then let vengeance find me last, after justice has its meal." The church groaned as if to agree, dust falling like judgment. The morning smelled of iron and sap as Amos Reed laid out a map on a crate and weighed it with 3 bullets and a bone button. Amos Reed said, "Choose the road that costs you least later." Jack stared at the freight yard sketched in charcoal and silence. Eli Carter hovered at the edge, trying to read fate like a ledger. Lila Dawson watched the lines as if they were stitches that could hold. Jack said, "Hale keeps rifles at the grain sheds and men in the tower." Amos nodded once, a slow hinge. Amos Reed said, "Then you move like drought, not flood." Jack traced a route that bent through shadows and past the spur. Eli said, "Tell me where I stand." Jack pointed to a flank and breathed patience into the air. Lila Dawson said, "I can turn the yard watch for a breath." The sun climbed and burned doubt to ash. Jack said, "We take the freight yard at dusk, and we do not miss." The plan owned them as the wind shifted. Noon hammered the town flat while Victor Hale gathered riders like a harvest gone wrong. He paced the saloon balcony and counted guns with a smile that did not bend. "Victor Hale," said, "sweep the yard, choke the tracks, guard the tower." Cole Maddox stood below, jaw clean, eyes colder than law. Cole Maddox said, "Order holds if the throat is gripped." The riders laughed too loud and checked rifles as if they were scripture. Hale lifted a gloved hand, and the street hushed like a church that had learned fear. Jack watched from an alley and tasted old smoke. Lila Dawson drifted past the stable with a look that made secrets turn their faces. Eli Carter counted men and swallowed hard. Amos Reed whispered, "They overstack the strong side." Jack said, "Then we walk through the thin seam." A bell tolled once, and dust rose like a curtain before a play no one could leave. Dusk leaned across the freight yard like a long hand when Lila Dawson slipped between boxcars and breath. Her step whispered over cinders. She found Jack by the coupler iron and did not waste words. Lila Dawson said, "2 men in the tower, 3 at the east shed, 1 drunk and 1 mean." Jack read her face and the risk written there. He said, "Why tell me now?" She swallowed, then lifted her chin. Lila Dawson said, "Because my brother breathes where Hale keeps chains, and I want him breathing tomorrow." Eli Carter flinched at the naked truth and steadied his rifle. Amos Reed watched her, old hurt and new math in his eyes. Jack said, "You will guide the tower light and tip it once." Lila nodded, fear held in a tight fist. The rails hummed with a distant train that would not come. Shadows deepened and the yard exhaled, wanting a verdict. The plan took shape like a trap that knew their names. Jack laid out timing with a finger on the rail. Jack said, "When the tower light tips, Eli runs the east shed and cuts their sight." Eli Carter shook once, then locked his gaze. Eli Carter said, "I stay with the cut until I hear you call." Amos Reed tested the wind and nodded to fate like an equal. Amos Reed said, "If the wind turns, we fold into the cattle pens and vanish." Lila Dawson adjusted her gloves and measured the tower with a gambler's eye. She said, "I can hold them baffled for 10 beats." Jack breathed that into the schedule and felt the night accept it. Far off, a dog barked and quit. The yard lanterns flickered and steadied. Jack said, "No heroics, only work." Eli smiled without brightness. Eli Carter said, "Work makes men last." The minute hand touched the hour like a trigger. Night settled full and clear, and the desert held its breath while Jack Mercer swung into the saddle and faced the town like a debt collector. He felt the weight of graves behind and the pull of names ahead. Amos Reed said, "Say the man you want to be before you draw." Jack's mouth tightened, and the answer stayed but shone. Lila Dawson met his eyes and offered the smallest nod a heart could risk. Lila Dawson said, "I will light the path you choose." Eli Carter rolled his shoulders and took his place on the flank. Eli Carter said, "I am here until the counting ends." The horses shifted, as if they knew the math. The church bell gave a single breath of metal, then slept. Jack said, "We ride slow, we move sure, we finish clean." The road gleamed like a blade. The town square waited, bright as a gallows star, and the night made room for the showdown. The town square burned in lamplight as dust swirled like smoke, and silence pressed down like a hand before thunder. Jack Mercer stepped into the open, boots striking with a sound sharper than gunfire. Victor Hale's riders fanned out, rifles angled like teeth. Eli Carter trembled but took his place at Jack's side, boyhood stripped away. Amos Reed's eyes narrowed, measuring exits that no longer mattered. Sheriff Cole Maddox strode forward, badge flashing like a curse. Cole Maddox said, "Step aside, Mercer. Law holds here." Jack said, "Your law died when it sold itself to Hale." The crowd scattered, pulling children into shadows. Hale leaned over the balcony, smile carved in stone. Victor Hale said, "Square's mine, Mercer. Leave bones if you must." Jack rested his hand on his revolver and said, "Then bones will speak." The night cracked with the first shot, and the square erupted into chaos. The square split with gunfire, sharp as axes. Eli ducked behind a trough as bullets cut the air. Amos Reed fired steady, hitting shadows that moved too fast. Jack Mercer advanced through smoke, each step measured. Cole Maddox drew and fired, his aim clean but cruel. Jack rolled into cover, dust rising in clouds. Eli shouted, "Jack!" Jack answered with lead, forcing Maddox back into lamplight. Cole Maddox said, "You cannot kill the law." Jack said, "Then the law dies on its own." Sparks burst as slugs hit iron rails. The crowd's screams rang like bells. Hale laughed from above, his voice drowning chaos. Victor Hale said, "Mercer, your rage feeds me." Jack lifted his revolver and shot the balcony rail, wood splintering near Hale's boots. The square filled with the smell of powder and fear. Amid the storm, Eli stumbled as a rifle barrel swung his way. Amos Reed moved faster than his years allowed, stepping between the boy and death. The shot rang, and Amos grunted as blood darkened his shirt. Eli screamed, dragging him down into cover. Amos Reed whispered, "Stay standing, boy." Jack saw it, fury freezing into clarity. He fired twice, dropping the rifleman who had taken aim. Eli Carter said, "No, you're not leaving me." Amos gripped his arm, eyes bright with final fire. Amos Reed said, "You carry more than me now." Jack forced himself back into motion, rage turned cold and exact. Eli pressed Amos' wound, but the elder only shook his head. Jack called, "Eli, eyes forward." The boy lifted his rifle, vision blurred by tears. The square swallowed Amos' last breath as the fight thundered on. Above the din, Lila Dawson emerged, her figure framed by smoke and lamplight. She moved fast, cloak flaring, and aimed her pistol at Hale's balcony guards. Her shots rang true, two men collapsing into shadow. Hale's eyes narrowed in sudden doubt. Victor Hale shouted, "You dare turn on me?" Lila Dawson said, "I choose my chains, and I break them now." Jack saw her fire again, clearing the balcony edge. Eli Carter cheered raggedly through grief, his rifle spitting fire at the street below. Cole Maddox pressed forward again, gun blazing, until Jack cut him off with steel. Their shots clashed, bullets biting dust inches away. Jack said, "You wore the law, but you fed it poison." Cole Maddox sneered, sweat and fury painting his face. Cole Maddox said, "Law bends to strength, not mercy." Their duel carved silence from the chaos around them. The duel narrowed to heartbeats. Jack faced Cole in the center of the square, dust curling around them like a curtain. Cole Maddox raised his pistol with flawless poise. Jack drew slower, but his eyes burned steady. Time split open as their shots cracked together. The crowd gasped, the echo stretching like a rope across the night. Cole staggered, a dark stain spreading across his chest, his badge gleaming one last cruel flash before he fell. Jack lowered his gun, chest heaving, face carved in stone. Eli Carter shouted, "Jack!" But Jack's eyes stayed fixed on Hale above. Victor Hale clapped once, slow and venomous. his voice dripping triumph. Victor Hale said, "Now only you and I." Lila Dawson reloaded quick, her gaze torn between Jack and Hale. Jack said, "Then the night ends with one voice." The square stilled again, waiting for the final reckoning. The square sank into a hush that tasted like iron and ash. Jack stepped to the center, dust spiraling around his boots. Victor Hale watched from the balcony, eyes bright with borrowed power. Victor Hale said, "End this and kneel." Jack lifted his chin and let silence say no. Lila steadied her breath and measured the drop to the rail. Eli tightened his grip and remembered Amos' last words. Jack said, "Debt comes due now." Hale drew first and thunder tore the night. Jack moved through the flash and answered clean. Wood screamed as bullets chewed the rail. A lamp burst and poured gold across the smoke. Hale faltered, and rage cracked his poise. Victor Hale said, "You live on ghosts." Jack said, "I live past them." The final shot rang like a bell no church could claim. Hale staggered and gripped the rail as if law lived there. His boot slipped on lamp oil, and the night caught its breath. He fell hard to the planks, pride breaking first. Victor Hale said, "You are nothing without my shadow." Jack walked close and holstered slow. Jack said, "Your shadow ends here." Eli lowered his rifle and felt the world grow heavier. Lila stepped forward and unpinned a ring from Hale's coat. She said, "This buys my brother's sunrise." Hale stared at the sky and found no purchase. The town watched from doorways like faces carved in bark. Jack's voice cut the quiet clean. Jack said, "The square belongs to its people now." Somewhere a child laughed once, small and defiant. The sound landed like a flag. The riders broke and ran, leaving rifles like molted skins. Jack and Eli crossed the square and knelt where the morning would find memory. Eli said, "He stayed so I could stand." Jack touched the dust and felt it answer. Jack said, "Amos bought this hour with the last of himself." Lila closed her eyes and let one tear go to ground. The church door groaned as if cleared of a weight. Windows opened in slow courage, and lanterns steadied. Jack lifted his head and breathed the town's first honest air in years. Eli said, "What do we build now?" Jack looked at the street and saw work instead of graves. Jack said, "Fences to guide and laws that do not sell." The square exhaled like a healed rib. Dawn bled into the facades and wrote kinder lines. Jack stood with Lila at the freight spur and watched steam ghosts lift from rails. Lila said, "I chose wrong for too long." Jack heard the tremor and did not look away. Jack said, "You chose different when it counted." Eli carried boards toward the broken door and paused. Eli said, "Say what comes next, so we can start." Jack pointed to the square where faces gathered. Jack said, "Bury the guns, count the harms, free the names Hale hid." Lila nodded and packed resolve where fear had lived. The bell rope swung without a hand and settled quiet. The day felt wide enough for mercy. By full morning the town moved like a chest, relearning breath. Jack saddled slow while Eli checked the cinch with careful hands. Lila stood close enough for truth and distance both. Lila said, "If you ride, ride clean." Jack smiled like a scar that had learned to heal. Jack said, "I will leave the road better than I found it." Eli looked toward the hills and squared his shoulders. Eli said, "I will keep the ledger honest." Jack swung up and faced the long sun. He tipped his hat to the square that had found its voice. The wind lifted the dust in a small blessing. Jack rode out steady, and the day did not argue.